Chapter 5, Fallacies of Diversion. Introduction. The fallacies in this chapter work by diverting attention from the proposition at issue. Each fallacy accomplishes this diversion in a different way, but the effect in each case is the same: to shift the focus of the argument. Worth noting is the locale of these fallacies. They typically reside in adversarial contexts, that is, when one person is attacking someone else's position or defending his or her position from someone else's attack. Some examples of adversarial contexts are political campaigns, management labor disputes, and public controversies over issues of vital importance such as capital punishment, abortion, and sexual harassment. In such cases, the arguer runs the risk of wanting too much to defeat the opponent, a desire that can work at cross purposes to the goal of arriving at the most reasonable position. Watch for these fallacies, then, particularly in adversarial contexts. Straw person. A cardinal principle that governs all argumentation is this: the position criticized must be the position actually held. This principle is particularly prone to violation in adversarial contexts, where each side may want to make the other side look bad. The temptation to distort the opponent's view is strong. What we call the fallacy of straw person is the direct result of a violation of this principle. Suppose you're having an argument with someone. The topic is one you feel strongly about. You are aware of several positions that you consider dead wrong. Now your antagonist makes a claim that sounds awfully close to one of those dreadfully mistaken views. In the heat of controversy, it is tempting to jump on your opponent for holding the view that you're familiar with and that you know or think to be false. You don't have the patience to listen to the significant differences between your opponent's actual position and the one you are eager to criticize. Or if you think your opponent's stand sounds downright dangerous or morally outrageous, your emotional antagonism can completely blind you to significant differences between what was said and what it reminds you of. You may launch into a defense of democracy or free enterprise or the institution of marriage when your opponent didn't really mean to put any of those in question. Finally, if you're devious, you can deliberately misrepresent the views of your opponent and proceed to make your opponent look silly for saying something he or she didn't say at all. In any case, when you misrepresent your opponent's position, attribute to that person an implausible or inaccurate version that you can easily demolish, and then proceed to argue against the trumped-up version as though it were your opponent's, you commit the fallacy of straw person. The fallacy also occurs when you wind up defending a position that is not really the one you're supposed to be defending. The following example from an interview with a TV news reporter illustrates the latter way of committing the fallacy. In the background here is the ongoing controversy about the relative merits of print journalism and electronic journalism, principally television news. Interviewer: how do you feel about the description of broadcast news as shallow and too entertainment-oriented? Reporter: well, I consider who's making the criticism. I spend a lot of time with print people, and once they get to know us, they understand we're as hardworking as they are. The position that the reporter is defending is not the position he should be defending if he intends to deal with the criticism mentioned by the interviewer, that broadcast news is too entertainment-oriented. The reporter makes it sound as though the issue were how hard-working electronic journalists are. It's as if the question was, what do you say to the criticism that you broadcast journalists are not hard-working? But that was not the question at all. The reporter's response was thus guilty of defending against a criticism that had not been made, that broadcast news reporters are not hard-working, and, In the course of doing this, failing to respond to the criticism that was made, that broadcast news is too entertainment-oriented. The exchange we are going to look at now contains a sequence of instances of this fallacy. It appeared in the Windsor Star several years ago. The topic is capital punishment. First, we quote part of the letter to the editor that started the debate off. It is from Professor Lawrence Lefebvre, who is opposed to capital punishment. The vast majority of Canadian police officers appear to favor capital punishment, especially when one of their colleagues is murdered in the line of duty. These officers are entitled to their opinion. However, the public should not take their views on this subject seriously, and the mass communications media, with special reference to the Windsor Star, should not continue to give so much space to their views. Reading comprehension test. Without glancing back at the example, we ask you to respond to the items below. Professor Lefebvre opposes letting police express their opinions. True or false? Professor Lefebvre thinks the public should disregard the views of police on capital punishment. True or false? Professor Lefebvre thinks media should not report the views of police on capital punishment. True or false? Professor Lefebvre thinks the pro-capital punishment view of police should be censored. True or false? We think the correct answer is, in each case, false. We will go through the statements one by one and give you our reasoning. 1. Lefebvre never says police should not be allowed to express their opinions, nor anything close to it. The only thing he says that might relate to whether police should be allowed to express their pro-capital punishment views is his statement that they are entitled to their opinion. That might be understood to imply that he thinks they should be allowed to express it. Certainly he nowhere says they shouldn't be allowed to. 2. This statement is tricky. Lefebvre does say the public should not take their views on this subject seriously, but that does not mean they should disregard their views. For instance, you may not take the views of terrorist revolutionaries seriously and still think it important not to disregard those views completely. You don't ponder their ideology trying to decide whether to adopt it yourself, but you do make a point of noting it, particularly since it represents a threat to international security. In short, we would argue that not taking something seriously is not equivalent to disregarding it. 3. Lefebvre didn't encourage the media not to report police views. He merely urged them to reduce the amount of space devoted to reporting the police viewpoint. 4. Lefebvre said absolutely nothing at all about suppressing or censoring police opinions, nor did anything he said lead to such a suggestion. What we've said about disregarding goes for ignoring those opinions too. If you answered true to any of these questions, it may be that you did not read carefully enough. We cannot stress too much the importance of avoiding attributing to someone views they did not express. Unless you do, you won't be evaluating the actual assertions you're looking at. You'll be criticizing a different position, and you will thus commit what we call the fallacy of straw person. It's hard to listen carefully to or read thoughtfully the arguments of someone who espouses a view you consider harmful or dangerous. Yet the practice of argumentation demands that you do so. Although there is a dimension of this task that depends on character and integrity, skill is also involved. You can learn to do a better job of hearing the position of someone you deeply disagree with by paraphrasing it. The reciprocity exercises we discuss later will help develop that skill. The point of the recent exercise was not just to emphasize the importance of careful reading, but to prepare you for the Windsor Star's editorial response to Professor Lefebvre. The Star began by quoting the segment of the letter we've been looking at, and then went on to say, "Wrong, Dr. Lefebvre. Police officers are entitled to their opinion, as your letter says. But police officers and other groups are also entitled to express their opinions and have them reported. The media would be failing in their responsibility if they did not give space to the opinions of all groups. And on the subject of capital punishment, a good case can be made for greater attention to the views of police groups, which are close to the situation. Nor should such views be disregarded by the public. The Star agrees with Dr. Lefebvre in his opposition to capital punishment and disagrees with the anti-abolition stand that he feels is the majority view of Canadian police officers. But the Star does not agree that the view should be suppressed, censored, or ignored. Democracy is a process of making choices after the facts are known, the alternatives discussed, and the opinions weighed. We believe the Star is guilty of 4 counts of straw person in its rejoinder. The fallacy can be characterized in general in terms of the following conditions listed in the box, so we'll need to show that the Star's response to Lefebvre qualifies on each point. Straw person. 1. A critic attributes a particular position to an opponent. 2. The opponent's position is not the one the critic attributed to him or her, but a different one. 3. The critic criticizes that different position as though it were the position actually held by the opponent. Typically, the attributed view will be a much easier position to attack than the actual position. That's where the straw part of straw person comes in. It is easier to rip apart a straw figure, an effigy, than it is to take apart a real one. The fallacy consists of not only distorting the arguer's position, but subsequently attacking the distorted, and usually easier to attack, position. In the case of the Star, we've already shown that the first 2 conditions of the fallacy are satisfied. We based our reading comprehension test on 4 statements that the Star appears to have attributed to Lefebvre. The editorial says, "Wrong, Dr. Lefebvre," referring to the first 3 claims, and the second paragraph proceeds to disagree with the 4th claim. If you reread the editorial, you'll see that it supports claims it takes to be opposed to Dr. Lefebvre's position. That's one standard way of criticizing a position. Show its opposite to be true. Of course, this procedure also reinforces the erroneous impression that Lefebvre actually did hold the opposite view. The parade of straw persons in this exchange did not end with the Star's editorial response to Professor Lefebvre. He then wrote a rejoinder to the Star calling attention to the distortions we have noted and adding, "The Star suggests I am anti-democratic. By its view of democracy, if an inmate of an institute for the feeble-minded, innocent of physics, argued that he had refuted Einstein's theory of relativity, his statement ought to be granted as much press coverage as the same claim made by an eminent physicist. If 10 out of 10 physicians believe a man has measles, while 11 out of 11 street cleaners deduce he does not, then by Star logic, he, by a vote of 11 to 10, does not have measles." Lefebvre's point here is that the Star is committed to a view of democracy that would give the incompetent as much voice as the expert, and permit majority rule to decide in matters best left to specialists. Now Lefebvre is the one who's guilty of straw person. Before we argue that, we offer 2 observations. First, look at our sentence following this last quotation from Lefebvre. In that one sentence, we have compressed his views and given an interpretation of what he's saying or actually committed to. We've tried to cut through the metaphors and express the point that it seems he meant to make. Slipping your fingers through the rhetoric and withdrawing the kernel of assertion is a skill you'll need to become proficient at. Second, notice too that Lefebvre was extrapolating the view of democracy he attributed to the Star. He was drawing an inference from what was said. The position he attributed to the Star was one he took to be logically implied by what it stated. Specifically, he took 3 points. 1, the Star's insistence that it should give space to police opinions about capital punishment. 2, the Star's disregarding his own claim, argued elsewhere in his letter, that the police have no special competence to judge the merits of capital punishment. And 3, the Star's lecture on democracy. From these 3 points, he drew the inference that the Star endorsed a view of democracy that would allow majority rule to decide on matters requiring specialized knowledge and would give equal media coverage to the views of laypersons and authorities on subjects calling for such expertise. This move, extrapolation from a stated position, is frequently used in argumentation as a way of exploring the merits of the position. In making it, to avoid the straw person fallacy, one must stick to inferences logically warranted by the original position. We contend that in his response, Professor Lefebvre commits straw person because he attacks, by ridicule, an extrapolation not entailed by the Star's stated view about democracy. We say it's not entailed because we don't think enough is said in the brief response to be able to pin this view onto it. The Star may hold this view, but neither Lefebvre nor we can know that from the scant bit that's been said. In ridiculing a view of democracy that he had no adequate grounds for attributing to the Star, Lefebvre committed the very fallacy which he had rightly accused the newspaper of. It should be clear that your capacity to detect this fallacy depends on your knowing the positions taken by others on matters you're interested in. If you don't know who holds what positions on the issues you're dealing with, then you'll find yourself persuaded by straw person criticisms. Earlier, we said that all argumentation must abide by this principle. The position being criticized must be the position actually held. Even a critic with honorable intentions may unwittingly alter the position he or she is attacking, which leads to another principle of logical defense. When two individuals are on opposite sides of an issue, the accuracy of either statement or any other representation of the views of the opponent must be checked. In other words, be cautious of the move that begins, "Now my opponent believes that, but such a view is surely wrong because." Our advice is, find out for yourself what the opponent's position is. Don't take the critic's word for it. If you follow these 2 principles, and if you have some awareness of and information about the issues being discussed, you will avoid being diverted by straw person rejoinders. There is one final matter which we want to discuss in this connection: reciprocity. An exercise that we recommend goes like this. The exercise works best if A and B are on opposite sides of the issue. A states his position, including, if you like, some of the reasons why he thinks his position is correct. Then B has to do 2 things. 1, restate A's view to his satisfaction, and 2, restate A's reasons for holding the position, again to his satisfaction. Then, and only then, is B allowed to enter a criticism of A's view or his reasons for holding it. The process can then be repeated with A and B switching roles. To do this, A must now restate B's critical conclusion about her own position to B's satisfaction. Then A must restate B's reason to B's satisfaction. Only then may A respond to B's criticisms. The process can go on indefinitely, with each side restating the views and the reasoning of the other to the other's satisfaction. What the exercise demands is the ability, one not easily acquired, to set forth a position with which one does not agree and the reasoning behind it, and to do this to the satisfaction of someone who takes that position. This is good dialectical training, and it provides an experiential reference point for nipping straw persons in the bud. Ad hominem. When you disagree with something, the logically appropriate response is to direct your analytic powers to that position, examine its premises, look for any fallacies, and/or look at its implications. We have just seen one way in which arguers divert attention from the issue and the position, by attacking a straw person, a distorted version of the arguer's position. Another common tactic in adversarial contexts is to ignore the issue altogether and, instead, attack the person who asserted it, either by casting aspersions on the person's character and background, or perhaps by discussing his or her motives. In some cases, such an attack is, in fact, appropriate, and we'll discuss those cases. But in a great many instances, such an attack is beside the point. An irrelevant attack on the person instead of the position is the fallacy called ad hominem, literally against the person. Here is an example of one version. Abusive ad hominem. In the fall of 1989, Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, was published. In it, Bloom attacked rock music as an overtly sexual form of music that contributes to an overall climate of promiscuity. He mentioned Mick Jagger's pouty lips and wagging butt as examples of how rock promotes sexuality. In a review of the book in Rolling Stone, William Grider wrote, "Bloom's attack on rock is inane. Still, the professor is correct about one important distinction between the kids of the 50s and those of the 80s. In the 50s, the kids talked endlessly about sex. Today, the young people actually do it. This seems to drive the 56-year-old Bloom, who is still a bachelor, crazy. Bloom denounces Jagger with such relish that one may wonder if the professor himself is turned on by Mick's pouty lips and wagging butt." After his initial statement, which signals his strong disagreement, Grader's response consists of an attack that is largely personal. He makes no attempt to deal with Bloom's arguments. He might, for example, have argued that Bloom makes casual claims that are not well supported by evidence. Instead, his comments are little more than innuendo about Bloom's own sexuality. He is still a bachelor. Because we have difficulty seeing how one's marital status would disqualify a person's views on rock music, Bloom's status as a bachelor would seem to have no bearing on his argument about rock music. Next, Grider indulges in a bit of lay psychoanalysis, hinting that perhaps Bloom secretly likes Jagger's butt and so is highly repressed. The implication here is that Bloom is homosexual. Even if this were true, it would not have any relevance to an appraisal of Bloom's argument. Bloom's argument is about the effects of rock music on sexuality in general. His own sexuality is not the issue. So this remark is irrelevant and makes no contribution whatsoever. Thus, Grider is guilty of ad hominem. We call this an abusive ad hominem because it consists largely of personal abuse. In an issue of Harper's Magazine, James Kennison had an article called China Stinks, detailing his year's experience in the Chinese province of Sichuan. What Kennison had to say about Sichuan was not flattering, and it brought this response in Harper's. "I regret that Harper's was used as a vehicle to spread the stench by James Kennison, who wrote the article China Stinks, which appeared in the April issue. I can't believe that such a distinguished magazine would want to nauseate its readers with such undigested material. It is obviously the work of a constipated and jaundiced man who has just spent a year in outlandish and poverty-stricken Sichuan, where there was no running water, toilet, or other amenities of life to which Mr. Kennison had been so accustomed in Indianapolis. Instead of addressing the response to the actual assertions that make up Kennison's position, the writer attacks Kennison personally in the words we italicized. In effect, he is psychoanalyzing Kennison, claiming that his own disappointment with conditions in Sichuan caused him to write an unsympathetic article. That may well be true, but it must first be shown that Kennison's position is inadequate. If his facts were incorrect, his interpretations questionable, then the critic should be prepared to detail these for us instead of launching a personal attack on the author. Such an attack is irrelevant. We don't need to know or determine whether Kennison was constipated, literally or metaphorically, as far as assessment of his position goes. We don't need to know whether he was accustomed to a comfortable life. This irrelevant attack on the person is another instance of the abusive ad hominem fallacy, since the critic's main focus is on the person of the arguer and consists of little more than heaping abuse on Kennison. Circumstantial ad hominem. By contrast, the circumstantial ad hominem fallacy occurs when, instead of abusing the person, the arguer refers to circumstances in the arguer's situation and uses that reference to discredit the arguer's position. In Backlash 1991, Susan Faludi discusses the apparent change in direction of Betty Friedan's thinking between the feminine mystique in 1963 and the second stage in 1981. After briefly recapping Friedan's position, Faludi asks, why was Friedan stomping on a movement which she did so much to create and lead? If you are wondering about the appropriateness of stomping on, you're onto an important concern, one we take up in Chapter 7 in a discussion of the role of language in argumentation. After considering one explanation for Friedan's change in direction, that the backlash tendency makes it inevitable to turn and bite one's tail, Faludi writes, but in Friedan's case, another possibility presents itself as well. A closer reading of the second stage suggests that the prime mistake the radical feminists made was not following her orders. Her book is punctuated with the tantrums of a fallen leader who is clearly distressed and angry that she wasn't allowed to be the alpha wolf leader as long as she would have liked. Even if Faludi's claims are true, without a detailed critique of Friedan's position, these remarks amount to a circumstantial ad hominem. Instead of directly dealing with the logical strengths and weaknesses of Friedan's position, she attacks the person by referring to the circumstances that led to Friedan's position. Even if she were correct, this would not be relevant to an assessment of Friedan's claims about the movement. Friedan's reasoning and her evidence have not been addressed, and their validity cannot be determined simply by reference to the circumstances of her life. For another instance, consider this letter to the World Press magazine, April 1992, page 2. Philip Adams comments that Americans have enthusiasm for assassinating national leaders, are high on individualism and low on ideology, can no longer distinguish reality from the movies, and that America is a society that is patently going bonkers, really sting. Is this why we have such a love affair with Australia? An affair that has made vacationing there such a large and rapidly growing industry? Whether Americans are vacationing in Australia has no bearing on whether Adams' comments are truthful or insightful. His comments have to do with problems in American society, a penchant for assassinating national leaders, and so on. But the letter writer is attempting to combine Adams' personal circumstances, he is an Australian, with the fact that Americans in large numbers now vacation in Australia to discredit his criticisms. The implication is, if we're so crazy and we like your country, what does that say about your country? This may work as effective put-down on television, but as a reply to Adams' criticisms, it is beside the point. Ad hominem is characterized by the conditions listed in the box. Ad hominem. 1. The critic responds to the position of an arguer by launching a personal attack on the arguer, ignoring the arguer's position. 2. The personal attack on the arguer is irrelevant to any assessment of the argument. To show how to use the conditions in the box, we use the following example. In the fall of 1991, the United States Senate held hearings to determine whether federal Judge Clarence Thomas should become an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. A former employee of Thomas's by the name of Anita Hill, alleging that Thomas had engaged in activities that could be considered sexual harassment, said, among other things, that he had, in her presence, made reference to a pornographic film featuring a character named Long Dong Silver, and had also asked out loud about a pubic hair on my coke. In a column following the hearings, a columnist for the Detroit Free Press wrote, "Not that there weren't figures at the hearing who rode heroically against the stream. Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah, he of the shuddering little chin, fulminated against the perversity of the accusations against the nominee. Imagine a respectable man making reference to pubic hairs on Coke cans to a woman. Imagine such a man watching films of Long Dong Silver. The senator really ought to get a life. The porn industry would go broke in a week if it were patronized only by drooling perverts." The columnist is guilty of ad hominem. Here is our reasoning. First, the columnist responds to a position Hatch has taken by attacking Hatch, rather than his position. Hatch's position is that Thomas is a man of such character that the remarks attributed to him could not and would not have been made by him. The columnist attacks Hatch first by referring to his shuddering little chin, a feature that is meant to indicate weakness in his character. The next personal attack comes when he says that Hatch ought to get a life, implying that he is naive and out of touch. Second, the attack on Hatch is irrelevant to any assessment of his position. Hatch is defending Thomas, and certainly it would have been possible to criticize and evaluate his defense without making abusive remarks about his character. Thus those attacks were here irrelevant, and we would charge the columnist with ad hominem. We need to make two additional comments. First, you may not have noticed the straw person the columnist slipped in. The issue here was not whether Thomas had watched pornographic movies, but whether he had made unwelcome sexual remarks in the presence of Anita Hill. In this context, the issue of Thomas's watching pornography was not what should have been argued. Rather, the point should have been that his references to pornography did not constitute sexual harassment. Notice how much more difficult this case would be to make. Second, in becoming a candidate for the position of Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Thomas's record as a jurist and his character are both fair game. That is, not only the alleged instances of sexual harassment, but also his attitudes toward and his personal use of pornography are potentially legitimate issues. There are instances when reference to character is relevant. As we have seen, an attack on the person can come in a variety of forms. A criticism of his or her personality or character, a derogatory crack about the person's ethnic or racial background, a condemnation of behavior, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones is an example of that one, or speculation about motives or special interests. In fact, any response that attacks the person can be ad hominem if it steers attention away from the issue under debate and toward the person who proposed it. Legitimate attacks on the person. However, and we want to put this however in flashing lights, finding a controversy in which someone has been potentially criticized is not enough to charge the fallacy of ad hominem. In certain situations, it is relevant to attack a person as a means of discrediting that person's views. That's why we require that condition 2 exist in order for an argument to be a fallacious argument ad hominem. It's difficult to come up with a rule of thumb for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate criticisms of the person when the dispute is over a position. Each case will have to be judged on its merits. Instead of a rule of thumb or a general principle indicating when it is relevant to attack the person, and hence when such an argument cannot be considered an ad hominem fallacy, we describe 3 sets of circumstances under which an ad hominem argument may be legitimate. Appeals to authority or to expert opinion. If, in the course of developing my argument, I ask you to believe something I say by arguing that an authority or expert on the subject says it's true, you may legitimately question the background or motives of that authority. If I'm asking you to accept the point just because she or he says so, then it's fair to challenge credentials and to be critical of the authority's interests. Suppose I tell you that Nikes are good basketball shoes and cite Bo Jackson's endorsement of them as my authority. If you point out that Jackson is employed by Nike to make their commercials, you don't commit ad hominem, even though you are questioning his motives in endorsing the product instead of evaluating the shoes on their own merits. For in the case we're imagining, Jackson's endorsement of the shoes may be judged, indeed should be judged, in the light of his tie with the manufacturer. He would not have an interest in people's buying those shoes whether they were good ones or not. On the other hand, he might have chosen to endorse Nike's shoes over the other brands because of their superior merits, and this possibility should also be considered in evaluating the argument. Candidates for positions of public trust. No matter what arguments they put forward for being qualified for the office sought, it is always legitimate to consider the character and background of political office seekers. Not every facet would be fair game for critical appraisal. It wouldn't particularly matter if the leader of a party turned out to prefer the Rolling Stones to Ravel. If, on the other hand, she has a history of coronary attacks or is suffering from an incurable disease, these factors would probably outweigh even the best arguments for electing her, and someone who made them known would not be guilty of ad hominem. In between these extremes are questions like, how relevant is the candidate's sexual behavior? In the 1992 presidential campaign, a great deal of media attention was given to allegations that Clinton had been unfaithful to his wife. Many people were uncomfortable with this line of questioning because they were unclear about the relevance of this issue to the question of his suitability for the presidency. But on the whole, candidates for public office are vulnerable to personal attacks, and the reason is clear. In electing an official, we elect the human being, not just the mind that shapes the policies. The character of that human being is relevant, though most would argue that there is a line between aspects of character that are purely personal, like liking broccoli, and have no effect on trust, and other aspects of character, such as believability, that are relevant. Marital infidelity is in a gray area. Cases of credibility. Courtroom proceedings furnish the clearest examples here. Suppose someone has testified in court. If that person is found to be a habitual liar, then this fact damages his or her credibility. The lawyer who points out this personality trait is attacking the person as a means of discrediting the testimony, not as an alternative to confronting it. It should be clear what makes certain ad hominem arguments fallacious. An argument is an attempt to elicit our consent to the truth of a proposition by appealing to other propositions we accept and showing how the acceptance of those leads rationally to the conclusion. In argumentation, we eschew appealing to force, flattery, or personality. If you disagree with a claim, logic demands that you inspect the reasons put forward to support it. You normally need know nothing about the person who happens to put forward the claim, whether he or she is rich or poor, college or high school educated, supports the Republicans or Democrats. If arguing ad hominem is so often clearly fallacious, then why do people continue to do it and to be persuaded by it? We suspect it's because there's something emotionally satisfying about putting down someone you disagree with. It's irritating to admit that someone you dislike has made a valid point. Also, when you identify with a view, an attack on it seems like an attack on you. So it's natural to counter with a personal challenge of your own. Logical self-defense requires some detachment from your beliefs. It also requires that both arguer and critic embrace the Socratic ideal of pursuing the truth wherever the path to it may lead. To conclude our treatment, we want to discuss the relationship between ad hominem and some other arguments frequently used along with it. Poisoning the well. We have mentioned abusive and circumstantial ad hominem fallacies, but sometimes people will talk about poisoning the well. This means trying to cast doubt in advance upon an issue, usually by referring to that person's motives and in this way compromising his or her position. This is much like the abuse of ad hominem. When the aspersions are irrelevant to the issue, it is a form of ad hominem fallacy. Here is an example. Let us suppose that Dr. Hubbard is a member of the American Medical Association, and let us suppose further that that organization has gone on record as being opposed to voluntarily assisted euthanasia. Now Dr. Hubbard develops his own line of argumentation in support of the AMA's position. Someone then responds to his argument by stating, "Of course you're supporting the AMA's position. You're a member. What else can you do?" Here the critic is trying to discredit Hubbard's argument by referring to certain circumstances in his life. But the fact that he is a member of the AMA and that that organization opposes voluntarily assisted euthanasia is irrelevant as far as assessing the merits of Dr. Hubbard's own argument. This is called poisoning the well because the arguer is attempting to discredit the position in advance by appealing to irrelevant features. In Backlash, Faludi, again discussing Friedan, claims, "Anyone who disagrees with her is simply dismissed as one of those radical feminists who is still locked into the first stage thinking themselves and threatened by my attempt to reconceptualize the movement. If that is Friedan's position, then she is guilty of poisoning the well by attempting to discredit criticisms of her position in advance by castigating those who advance them." Tu coquet. Closely related to poisoning the well is the fallacy sometimes called tu coquet, which literally means "you're another," or "but you're doing it too." Recall the example given in Chapter 4 about a group of members of the Canadian House of Commons who were discovered to have vacationed in Florida after officially taking the position that Canadians should be spending their tourist dollars in Canada. When people found out about this, many were outraged, telling their representatives, "Here you are doing the very thing that you object to." If this remark was construed as an argument against the position taken by the government representatives, then it was a form of ad hominem argument. The fact that the representatives did not follow their own advice certainly suggests a kind of character flaw in them, a moral failure. But it does not, in and of itself, invalidate or detract from their position. Remember, however, that in some contexts, the inconsistency of actions and words may be an appropriate line of criticism. There are cases, for example, where someone acts in a way that is contrary to the way she has advised others to act, and her reasons for doing so are good reasons for others to do so as well. In such a case, she has undermined her own advice and undercut her own position. Here is one author's reasoning. Say that I am a libertine priest. If I ask you to take my advice on my authority, but don't myself follow that advice, you are justified in thinking that my morals undermine my logic. They undermine my authority, which is why you are supposed to follow my advice. So too, the stockbroker, if I advise you to buy stock X while I am dumping X, you are justified in doubting my logic because you doubt my probity. To conclude this section, we discuss another fallacy often found in political discourse, guilt by association. Guilt by association. This fallacy involves attempting to downgrade a person's position by attacking the person instead of the argument, but here the attack on the person is indirect. The person is attacked in terms of his or her alleged associations and relationships. Suppose one of your friends works for a daycare center and another works for a family planning bureau. Because of these friends, your parents conclude that you're one of those radical feminists and a pro-abortionist. Suppose you express agreement with environmentalists' concerns about pollution from petroleum exploration in the Arctic, so your friends accuse you of being a green freak. What has gone wrong? Certainly, people who associate with one another have some common interest, but that doesn't mean all their beliefs are identical. Groups can have some beliefs in common without accepting everything the others believe. These obvious truths tend to be ignored in the heat of debate, especially in an adversarial context. You may be tempted to transfer some perceived discredit to an opponent based on some association that person has with a supposedly discreditable individual or group. The attack is usually, though not always, ad hominem in form, since its objective is to refute or discount the opponent's position by attacking his or her person. But it is an indirect strike against the person, made by transferring alleged guilt that has accrued to someone else, or to some other group or doctrine, to the opponent, using the connection between them as a bridge. When the mere association is not reason enough to attribute any opprobrium to the opponent, we call this move the fallacy of guilt by association. When the president of the Canadian Medical Association, Dr. Betty Stevenson, pressed for liberalized abortion laws, her stance provoked this letter in response. Perhaps it is not the law which ought to be called into question, but the arrogant attitude of the president of the medical society. Laws should be designed to afford reasonable protection for all human life. Statutes made and enforced by sensible, civilized societies should not provide for the thoughtless, wholesale slaughter of those considered to be less than human by some. Remember Dachau and Auschwitz. By associating the doctor's position with Nazi concentration camps, where millions of Jews and other undesirables were murdered under Hitler's horrifying program of genocide, the writer invites enormous antagonism to the doctor's views. To make the association, the writer had first to create a straw person, which he or she did by describing Dr. Stevenson's proposals for more liberal abortion laws as entailing the thoughtless, wholesale slaughter of those considered to be less than human by some. With this distortion in hand, the writer had only a slight jump to make to forge a link with Nazi extermination camps. But the link is complete fabrication. The president wasn't calling for thoughtless and wholesale slaughter. Furthermore, favoring liberalized abortion laws does not require believing that the fetus is less than human. One might, for example, take the position that the fetus is a human being, but that the mother's right to life can, in some circumstances, take precedence over the fetus's. Finally, even if the doctor did believe that a fetus is less than human, that's not the same as considering it subhuman in the way Hitler and the Nazis viewed so-called non-Aryans. The writer committed guilt by association by alleging a non-existent association. Sometimes the fallacy occurs when the association does exist, but isn't strong enough to support the connection based on it. The conditions listed in the box cover guilt by association. Guilt by association. 1. The critic attacks the arguer on the basis of some alleged association between the arguer and some other person or group. 2. The alleged association either A. does not exist at all, or B. does not provide relevant or sufficient support for the critic's attack. We conclude our treatment of guilt by association with an example from Scotland. When Queen Elizabeth II visited there some years ago, there was a demonstration by anti-royalist students, which occasioned this news item. 400 students chanted obscene songs and hurled insults at the Queen, jostling the royal entourage during a ceremony at the university. The scenes involving the Queen were the worst ever during her reign and were criticized by leading Scots. The chairman of the Conservative Party said, "The damage done to all Scotland's image across the world is incalculable." The chairman's fears would have a foundation only if we assumed that people around the world would commit guilt by association, blaming all Scots for the rowdiness of a few students. In a world of good reasoners, his fears would be groundless. Red herring. You will recall the spiked doll example we used to illustrate the generic fallacy of irrelevant reason in Chapter 4. Some consumers objected to a doll whose head, when removed, a feat which toddlers could manage, revealed a dangerous spike. They wanted the government to outlaw the product. A spokesperson for the company that manufactured the doll replied to this proposal by saying, "No legislation is going to protect a child against the normal hazards of life." We argued then that this reply was irrelevant. The issue is not protecting children against the normal hazards of life, but protecting them against hazards that could readily be avoided. In defense of the spokesperson, one might say that he surely did not believe his reply was irrelevant. Its irrelevance was so blatant that it would be uncharitable to believe he could have intended it as a reason for not passing legislation to protect children against shoddy, poorly designed toys. If we accept this defense, then we are left with the question, what was the point of the spokesman's reply? It seems plausible to interpret it along the following lines. The toy company was under attack for a blatantly dangerous feature of its doll and faced pressure for legislation that would have forced it to redesign the doll and to recall all the spiked dolls already in the marketplace, both expensive prospects. No defense that would meet public acceptance seemed available. The public would hardly be sympathetic with the argument that this was the cheapest way to attach the doll's head, or that complying with the proposed legislation would cost the company money. In such a situation, it may have appeared that the best defense was to take the offensive, to set up a new issue, trying to protect children against the normal hazards of life, that has some tenuous connection with the old one, but where the company could hold a defensible position. Such a strategy, in effect changing the subject, would distract attention from the hazards of the spiked doll and take the heat off the company. While the strategy might not appear ethical to an impartial observer, it would at least be clear of the charge of blatant irrelevance. Whether or not we have accurately described the spokesperson's intent, his reply certainly could easily have had the effect of changing the subject and so distracting critics from the original issue. This move, intentional or not, is quite common in arguments in adversarial situations. It is called introducing a red herring, and from this term, which is in widespread use, we take the name for the fallacy it represents. This move is logically fallacious for, although the introduction of a red herring makes sense as a tactic of defense when under criticism, defense by counterattack, it remains logically irrelevant to the original issue in dispute. The origin of the term red herring makes it a good descriptive label for this fallacy. It comes from the sport of fox hunting, in which hunters on horseback follow a pack of hounds tracking a fox's scent. To divert the hounds from the hunt, either to save a good fox for another day's chase or to call off young hounds being trained, a real red herring, one that's been dried, smoked, and salted, is drawn across the fox's track ahead of the pack. The dogs are diverted by the fresher, stronger scent. The term's application to this fallacy is evident. A typical red herring was used by then-Senator Paul Martin, well known for extolling the virtues of his hometown of Windsor, Ontario, on the occasion of defending Windsor against a slur in Arthur Haley's novel about the auto industry, Wheels. Haley wrote of grimy Windsor across the border from Detroit, matching in ugliness the worst of its U.S. senior partner. According to press reports, Martin responded, "When I read this, I was incensed. Those of us who live there know that Windsor is not a grimy city. It is a city that has one of the best flower parks in Canada. It is a city of fine schools, hard-working and tolerant people." Martin's first point does tell against Haley's appraisal, for it can be argued that a city with an attractive flower park cannot be completely grimy. To put it another way, the existence of a superb flower park would at least be relevant to the issue of how grimy a place Windsor is. But the senator didn't continue building his case for Windsor's beauty as he might have by extolling its splendid rose gardens and miles of riverfront parkland. Nor did he mention the kind of empirical evidence that one would expect in considering the issue of grime, pollution counts, for example. Instead, he changed the subject. Fine schools and hard-working, tolerant people are no doubt an asset, but they have nothing to do with whether a city is grimy or ugly. The senator's shift here is a common type of red herring move. Martin began his defense of Windsor on topic, then shifted to an associated point, not strictly relevant to the attack. Perhaps Martin interpreted Haley's criticism of Windsor's physical appearance as part of a general critique of the city. That would explain his more general defense. It wouldn't alter the fact, however, that Haley's comment was restricted to Windsor's appearance. Nor would it make the senator's second point any less a distraction, inviting a shift in the focus of the debate and raising another issue. The effect, whether intentional or not, was to move the argument onto different ground, to terrain more favorable to Martin. It's harder to document the allegation that the quality of life in a city is lamentable than it is to show that the city is physically grimy and ugly. It is important not to think of this fallacy as necessarily one of intent. The difficulty we have in knowing the intentions of others would restrict our employment of the red herring tag. It would be an undue restriction because we often want to make a distractingly irrelevant response whether or not the person was trying to change the subject. Nor should we think in terms of the effect a response has in diverting the opponent's attention to a different topic, because that would mean we could charge red herring only when the opponent was duped by the irrelevant rejoinder. Hence, the presence of the fallacy would then depend on the cleverness of the opponent. An odd situation, since we'd want to say that the clever opponent exposed the fallacy or avoided it. We would not want to say, paradoxically, that the fallacy didn't exist because the opponent spotted it. Certainly, a paradigm of red herring is an exchange in which someone deliberately introduces a diversion to try to divert the opponent's attention from the point under controversy. And as a result, the opponent is distracted by the diversion and follows it up, leaving behind the original issue. We find it more useful, however, to use the label for responses to attacks in adversarial contexts that, because they are close but not strictly relevant to the topic, invite the opponent to digress, whether or not the distraction is intended or successful. The conditions of the fallacy are listed in the box. Red herring. 1. In an adversarial context, an arguer makes a claim that is or implies a criticism of a position that his or her opponent holds or identifies with. 2. The opponent responds by introducing an issue that is not relevant to the original position, thereby inviting a shift of focus. Sometimes it is difficult to decide whether a particular consideration is a red herring. During the hearings to confirm Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill implied that Thomas was guilty of sexual harassment. Thomas responded, "I would like to start by saying unequivocally, categorically, that I deny each and every single allegation against me today. I cannot shake off these accusations because they play to the worst stereotypes we have about black men in this country." Is this a red herring? Well, the judge responds directly to the charge, so there is no evasion. But of what relevance is the claim of stereotyping? Here the reader needs to know that one of the accusations made by Hill was that he referred to the size of his own penis as being larger than normal. We need to add one consideration before concluding our treatment of red herring. The fallacy of red herring is often the result of the problem of failing to be clear about the difference between local and global relevance. If the issue introduced into the argument has some relevance to the question being addressed, when that question is considered broadly, it has global relevance. On the other hand, if the issue injected is not relevant to this particular argument about the issue, it does not have local relevance. With this treatment of red herring, we complete our list of discussion of fallacies of diversion. When evaluating an argument in an adversarial context, you should be consciously on the lookout for these fallacies. It might be helpful in keeping them in mind and also in keeping them distinct from each other in your mind, to be clear on how they are related. Figure 5-1 sets out their connections. This chart shows how the fallacies of diversion are related. Irrelevant reason. The generic fallacy of irrelevance goes to red herring, irrelevant response in an adversarial context that intends to sidetrack the issue, which branches off to straw person, irrelevant response in an adversarial context consisting specifically of attacking a misrepresentation of the opponent's position, and red herring also branches off to ad hominem, irrelevant response in an adversarial context consisting specifically of irrelevantly attacking the opponent instead of the argument, and ad hominem branches down to guilt by association, attacking the person indirectly by attacking some association of the person when that is irrelevant or insufficient to discredit the position.